Okay, so this first presentation is going to be covering the basic rules for NHSN, the rules that you're going to be using for most of your device-associated infections, as well as many of the infections that are included in Chapter 17 of the NHSN manual. How many of you know what I mean by Chapter 17? Most of you? All right, good deal. And we're going to speak this morning about the fundamental rules, surveillance rules for healthcare-associated infections. We're going to talk a little bit about calculators, checklists, and FAQs that we have so that you're aware of those tools. We'll also go into cover just briefly some 2019 updates to the fundamental surveillance rules, or those that are rules that are not limited to a single protocol. And that list is very short this year, so probably I'll be happy to hear that. Or maybe not. Maybe there's things you want changed that haven't changed. So first thing we're going to talk about are rules, and everybody loves rules, right? Well, we have to have rules in NHSN so that we're all doing things the same way and our data can be compared and for fairness and equity. I do want to just briefly cover a little bit of information because it's really important that we all understand that surveillanceers, as some people like to call what we all do, need to know the protocols and the criteria. And some of these things go without saying, but they do need to be said. And knowing those protocols and those criteria and having them in front of us when we're doing our surveillance really makes sure that we consistently apply them. And that's very, very important. It sometimes means that you're going to report events that you don't clinically believe are infections. And sometimes it means that you're not going to report infections that you clinically believe are infections. And the important thing is that we all do it consistently because we're really looking for trends. And we know that surveillance definitions can never meet clinical definitions exactly. It's just not possible. Patients are too complex, and it would be so hard to create rules and surveillance definitions that fit every single situation. It's just not possible. So, but it is important to remember that failing to consistently apply the definitions really is a breach of the NHSN rules of behavior that are set and that everyone signs when they join NHSN. It does result in decreased usefulness of the national comparative data. It really is not fair between facilities if one facility is not following the rules and reporting as they're supposed to. It can result in some discrepancies when and if your facility becomes validated by either your state or your or Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and it could potentially, because of that validation, impact the facility reimbursement from CMS. So importantly, concerns about the criteria should be sent to us so that we can consider them. They really shouldn't be handled by simply not reporting what meets criteria as an event, or by facility adjudication. I don't know that we hear that much more about facility adjudication as we used to, but I'm sure it still happens sometimes that there's a board that decides that an infection that's identified by an infection preventionist, whether or not it should be reported to NHSN. That's not how they should be handled. They really need to be reported, and let us know when you have concerns about things. We, as Denise said, we really do listen, and the changes that we make are most often as a result of input that we've heard from all of you. I just put this up here just to remind people, it is on our website, that concerns that we have heard from some facilities about gaming the system has resulted in the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the CDC to issue this joint statement, which I believe came out in 2015, which outlines, the requirements for reporting. And if you haven't seen this, I would suggest that you see it. It's also good to share sometimes if you are getting pressure from your facility about reporting according to the protocols. Okay, so my mouth is dry already. Just to start off, we do have some excluded organisms for which we do not report healthcare-associated infections. And these organisms are, it's not to say they could never be a healthcare-associated infection or cause one. They certainly could. Most often you might think of during construction in those times. They're community-associated organisms for the most part, and they have very long incubation periods. They cause a little bit of problems when you apply them to healthcare-associated infections for those reasons, and sometimes somebody might have something that shows up in their blood, and then they have to get reported as eclampsia, so we simply have removed them. So that's those that are listed here: plastomyces, histoplasma, coccidioides, paracoccidioides, cryptococcus, and pneumocystis. And in Chapter 2, which is what we're going to be covering this morning here, which covers healthcare-associated infections and present on admission definitions, we also identify that organisms that are associated with latent infections such as herpes, shingles, syphilis, and tuberculosis are excluded also from the healthcare-associated infections definitions. So for the next hour or so, we're going to be talking about basically the building blocks of NHSN patient safety component, healthcare-associated infection surveillance definitions. And as you can see, these definitions, the infection window period or IWP, the date of event, the present at admission, healthcare-associated infections, the repeat infection time period or RIT, and the secondary BSI attribution period, also known as the SBAP, are not applicable to some types of infections. SSI, Lab ID, and VAE, they all have their own rules for various reasons. But the rest of the infections they do apply to. Now, endocarditis has some special rules, and we'll talk about those. And you'll get coverage, as I said, information about the SSI, Lab ID, and VAE surveillance protocols. Okay, so we're going to talk about the IWP, the infection window period, which is really one of the basic concepts, and that is a period of time during which all of the elements of a criteria have to be met. It's 7 days in length, and it is the collection date of the first positive diagnostic test that's used as an element to meet the site-specific infection criterion, and then 3 calendar days before and 3 calendar days after. So what is a diagnostic test? Well, we consider a diagnostic test laboratory specimen. That's usually the most common type of diagnostic test that's used, but it could be an imaging test, maybe a chest x-ray or a CT scan, and less often a procedure or an exam. That's only if you don't have one of the other two, usually. We consider signs or symptoms, for example, diarrhea, site-specific pain, or purulent exudate. Those would not be diagnostic tests. Those would be signs or symptoms. So the date of event is the date that the first element used to meet the CDC NHSN site-specific infection criteria occurs for the first time within that 7-day window period. It might not be the first time that the element is present, but it's the first time during that 7-day period. And for endo, we actually have a 21-day period instead of a 7-day window period. We have a 21-day window period. So oftentimes people think that the date of event is going to be the date of the diagnostic test. It's not always, and oftentimes it's not. And if you think about it, that makes sense. The patient's having symptoms first, and that causes them to collect the test. So here's an example of an infection window period. It is the, for all the slides that I'm going to be presenting, it'll be the section in green. So as you can see, we have a diagnostic test on hospital day 13. We have a urine culture that's collected, that's positive. And then we have the 3 days and the before and the 3 days after for the infection window period. Let's look at this example. In this case, the patient has a different date of event, and that's because the first this is just identifying the date of event. So the diagnostic test was again on the 13th, but the first element during the infection window period was on the 11th, which was a temp of 101.5, and so that becomes the date of event. But this example is a little bit different, just to give you an example of what I was talking about, that the element might be present before the infection window period. So in this case, the date of event is still the 10th. So, and that's because we are not using any of the information outside of the infection window period. Yes, the temp was there on the day before, but we only look as far back as the infection window period to see if all of the elements were met, and they are. And so we use the first one during that IWP. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about what is a present on admission infection versus a healthcare associated infection, or POA. A POA infection for NHSN purposes is one where the date of event occurs on the day of admission to the inpatient facility or the day after admission. And the POA time frame, in order to meet all of the elements, however, does include 2 days before the day of admission, the day of admission, and the day after. So you do get 4 days to meet all of the elements, but the date of event has to occur during those first 2 days, or actually it could happen the day before admission. And if that's the case, so it's possible that you had a symptom here the day before admission and patient met criteria. And in that case, we would call the date of admission as a DOE, the date of event, or DOE. I do want to point out and highlight that, again, the definition talks about the date that the patient is physically admitted to an inpatient location. That means that the patient stays in your ED for a day or 2 days. The date of admission is considered the date they get physically moved to an inpatient location. That's very important, and sometimes people don't realize that. Okay. So you'll get more information about device-associated infections and from a couple of our presenters over the week. But just to give you a little bit of information beforehand, an infection that is considered device-associated, we have developed a time period of 2 days during which the device has to be in place for at least 2 days, and it also has to be either present on the day of admission or the day before in order to determine that that device is associated with the infection. And we do that the day before or the day of, because sometimes patients will have their devices removed, and then will be made aware that they have an infection, or the infection will present itself. And so we've provided a little bit of an incubation period for that reason. If an indwelling urinary catheter, and just to let you know, if you printed these out, I was looking these over last night and I realized that I had central line in here at some point, so I made a change. You might want to make that little change. If an indwelling urinary catheter, or IUC, was in place prior to the inpatient admission, the IUC day count that determines the device association begins with the admission date to the first inpatient location. So if somebody comes in with a catheter, you're not going to count the 2 days before they came in that they had the catheter. You're going to just start counting the day that they're admitted with that catheter. Okay. Last year we did make a change with denominators, denominator device day counts, and really we did this to be consistent and to make it as simple for you as possible. When you're trying to determine how many device days you've had in a location, so this is your denominator data, you're really just counting all of the devices that are present at the time of the count, regardless of whether or not they were accessed. So it used to be for central lines, we said if they came in with a central line and they didn't access it, you didn't count it in your device day count, your denominator day count. Now we'll just tell you if it's present, just count it. That makes it simple for you, and we hope is going to increase the consistency of the data that we receive. Okay, the transfer rule. The transfer rule, again, is something that we have created to try to take into account the an incubation period for these infections. And really all it says is that if a patient is transferred, if they develop an infection that day or the next day, you're going to attribute it back to where they were, okay, rather than the new location. And really, that's pretty simple. When it gets a little bit hard sometimes for people to make a determination is usually if the patient's been transferred multiple times within a very short time, a period of time. If that happens, the rule is to attribute the infection to the first location in which the patient was housed on the day before the date of event. And that really just provides the longest incubation time during the transfer rule. So there's some examples here which I won't go over except for the bottom one, which is a multi-transfer rule. And as an example, so the patient, as you can see, was in the ICU on day 1, day 2, and on day 3, they went to the ICU. From the ICU, they went to 5 West. And then for some reason, maybe they had some irregular heart rate, or for whatever reason, they got transferred to the CCU that same day. And the next day, they developed an infection, and that was the date of event. In that case, we're going to go back to the day before, and we're going to look for the first location, and that was the ICU on that day. So that's where we would attribute it to. Okay, the repeat infection time frame was a concept that we developed in 2015, and this really was to address the need to have a time frame around how facilities would make a determination if a patient has a new infection or it's the result of an infection that hasn't resolved. And we had provided guidance in the past to use some clinical judgment, and we really just needed to be objective and have objective definitions for that. And so that's why we developed the RIT. It was based on the time period that is normal for treatment for a healthcare associated bloodstream infection. So, and we had lots of clinical input, and 14 days was what was determined to be the most optimal. It's not a magic number. There is no perfect number, but it does seem to work well, we believe. So it removes the subjectivity of clinical determinations that we used to have. It's a 14-day time frame during which no new infections of the same type are reported. The date of event of the infection is day 1 of that 14-day period. And if the date of event for a subsequent infection occurs within that 14 days, we won't have you report a new event. If there are additional pathogens in that event, then we would just have you add those to the original if it was reported. Here's an example. So as I said, the green is always going to be your IWP, and the blue is always going to be your repeat infection time frame, or RIT. So in this case, the patient had, again, a urine culture collected that was positive on the 13th, and their date of event was the 11th, with the first date of an element during the IWP. And so the 11th is the first day of the 14-day urinary tract infection repeat infection time frame, and you can see it goes through the 24th. During that time, no new UTIs would be reported for the patient. What if, in this example, another positive urine culture is collected during the UTI RIT? As I said, the date of event here was the 11th originally, and then we had our 14-day UTI RIT, and during which time we had a urine culture collected on the 19th that falls within that RIT. We don't report another UTI. We don't have a new date of infection. We add the E. faecium, which is the new organism, to the originally reported infant, if it was reported. And you'll note that in this case, they had put a Foley in the patient in the meantime. We're not having you change that original infection to a catheter-associated UTI. That wouldn't make any sense. They had the infection before they had the Foley. So you don't change the device association. And hopefully that makes sense. The RIT applies at the level of the specific type of infection, with the exception of kind of the major types of infection that you, that's probably bad terminology, with the exception of the sort of the big infections that you report most often. So those are the bloodstream infection, the urinary tract infection, pneumonia. And at those cases, the RIT is going to apply at the major type of infection. Now I'll show you what we mean by that. Hopefully it will make sense to you, but as you can see, we have major types of infections and we have specific types of infections. Specific types are listed here on the right-hand side. So for skin and soft tissue infection, we have, 6 or 7 specific types of infection, including breast and decubitus infections. Well, it makes sense that a patient could have a breast infection and a separate decubitus infection, right? So we do allow those to be reported within the same RIT. So if the patient had a breast infection instead of breast RIT, that does not prevent you from reporting a decubitus infection during that time period. However, for the UTIs, the RIT applies at the major type of infection, and that means that you would not report both a SUDI and an ABUDI in the UTI RIT. Does that make sense? All right, so we're going to try our first poll everywhere. So you can participate by texting the message NHSN to 22333. So once I ask the question and list the answer choices, you can participate by texting the message NHSN to 22333 wants to join. Text messages fees, if you have them, could apply depending on your carrier. If this is your first time using Poll Everywhere, cell phone users, you will receive an initial text ensuring your privacy. In other words, that no sharing of your cell phone, cell number, etc. And then next, you'll receive a text confirming that you joined Cheryl Williams' polling session. And once you receive that confirmation text, you can go ahead and text back the letter that corresponds to your answer choice. Okay? Here we go. I guess you can, if you want to, you can participate via your computer as well. pollev.com/NHSN. All right, our first knowledge test. Your facility is performing CAUTI surveillance on your medical ward 5 West. A patient is admitted to 5 West on January 15th with urine culture positive for over 100,000 of E. coli. No NHSN UTI symptoms are present. The Foley is inserted at the time of a urine culture. 9 days later, on January 23rd, the Foley remains, and the patient has a temperature of 38.2 Celsius and a positive urine culture of greater than 100,000 of E. coli. So our question is, a CAUTI should be reported for this patient for 123. True or false? True is A. Okay. So I have a little bit of an issue. So it's not showing over here, and there's nothing. Thank you. Oh, that's okay. All right, so let's see what the correct answer is. So the correct answer is that a UTI criteria are not met related to the 115 urine culture, and let's talk about why that is.
Do you want to go back?
No, that's all right. The 115 urine culture was a urine culture alone, right? We didn't have any symptoms. So the patient didn't meet a urinary tract infection criteria. They didn't have a positive blood culture that matched to make it an ABUTI. So they didn't meet criteria. They just basically had an asymptomatic bacteriuria. So that didn't set any UTI RIT. And then on the 23rd, the patient had a positive culture again. And at this time, the patient was symptomatic. And so this patient met the criteria for a SUDI, a catheter-associated urinary tract infection that might be reported. Okay. So sometimes patients will meet more than one criterion. And when this happens, we tell you to always use the earliest date of the event. And that's because that's going to be helpful to identify maybe it's POA and it's not HAI. So you'll use that associated RIT and the secondary BSI attribution period. So in this example, you'll see that the patient has comes in on admission and has a fever, has hip pain, limited hip mobility, and they collect a positive blood culture, which is positive for Staph aureus. So the patient actually meets, has a date of event of the first day of admission, which makes this a POA infection. But notice that the patient also has an aspirated joint fluid on the fourth day of admission. And so if you use that, that's actually a criterion all of itself for joint. If you use that date of event would make this a healthcare associated infection. So you wouldn't want to do that, right? I don't think there's too many of you out there that are dying to do that. So for this reason, we always tell you to try to use, make sure that you use the earliest date of event that the patient can meet the criteria for. Okay. So secondary bloodstream infection attribution period, or SBAP, is a really important concept that you use a lot, obviously, when you're doing your CLABSI surveillance. And again, we had to create a period of time that we thought was reasonable for you to be able to associate a bloodstream infection to another infection. There's really not any literature that you can go to come up with this, but we took the input from a lot of clinicians, and that's how we came up with the time period that we have. It is the period during which a positive blood culture has to be collected to be considered a secondary bloodstream infection and not a primary bloodstream infection. That's when you're matching it to a primary site organism. So you've got a culture from another site and you want to know, does my blood culture that matches this, is it secondary? This is a time period you need to use. It's the infection window period plus the repeat infection time frame. And so when you actually work that out, it's a period between 14 and 17 days. And I'll show you why sometimes it's 14, sometimes it's 17. And just to say that a primary BSI would never have a secondary BSI attribution period. Hopefully that makes sense. You've got an RIT for that. So here's an example again, the urine culture, just to stick with the same scenario. Urine culture on the 13th, that's positive, and the fever. The date of event is the 10th. And in this case, the RIT is the 10th through the 23rd. And the SBAP is the same period of time. It's 14 days in this case. That's because the IWP is encompassed within the RIT. That'll probably make a little more sense when you see the next one. In this case, your SBAP is actually 17 days. And that's because the date of event, which really drives how long your SBAP is not the first day of your IWP. So we said the SBAP was the IWP plus the RIT. So in this case, it's actually 17 days. Okay. And we do that on purpose because we know that sometimes they'll draw blood cultures first, find a positive blood culture, and then they're looking for a primary source, and then they draw the other site-specific culture later. So we want to give you some buffer there. Okay, I mentioned that endocarditis has a different infection window period. It actually has a different SBAP and RIT as well. And that's because we recognize that endocarditis can be a long-term infection, one where they're drawing blood cultures quite frequently, either every day or every other day. And we heard from you that that was causing problems where you're having to call multiple or BSIs on the same patient. So the infection window period for endocarditis is actually 21 days in duration instead of 7. It's the collection date of the first positive diagnostic test, usually a blood culture, but it could be an echocardiogram, whatever happens first, usually the blood. The 10 calendar days before that and the 10 calendar days after that. And the RIT is the remainder of the patient's admission once they've met the criteria. The SBAP is the 21-day infection window period and all subsequent days of the patient's current admission. But there is a caveat to that it's limited to the organisms that were identified in the blood specimen that match the organisms that were used to meet the endo definition. So what does that mean? That means that if a patient comes in with a Staph aureus endo, we would not expect that during their stay that there would suddenly be an E. coli in their blood from the endocarditis. That really might mean that they've had a central line associated bloodstream infection, or maybe they have a urinary tract infection with secondary BSI. That's possible too, and you can look for that. But we're not allowing you to just add on organisms to endocarditis since it has such a long period. We are going to talk a little bit about secondary bloodstream infection rules. And I know that this is probably, how many of you think this is maybe one of the hardest things to do in surveillance? Is decide, several of you. And we're going to do, Latasha is going to cover secondary BSI attribution period, so you get lots of practice with that while you're here. But secondary bloodstream infections can be attributed to primary site infection during the SBAP if they meet one of two requirements, and those requirements are found in your secondary BSI guide, which is Appendix 1 in the BSI chapter, Chapter 4. And those are really the only two ways. One is that a blood organism matches at least one organism found in the site-specific infection criterion, and that site-specific criterion is used to meet the definition for that type of infection. Or the organism that's identified in the blood specimen is actually used to meet the criterion for that type of infection. Those are the only two ways. So here's an example of the site-specific organism matches at least one blood organism. So again, going back to our first example, the urine culture collected for E. coli on the 13th, and they have a fever to go along with that in a 45-year-old patient. They have a symptomatic urinary tract infection. And then during the SBAP in blue, they have a blood culture collected with at least one matching organism, in this case E. coli. So this is a SUTI with a secondary BSI, and the E. coli is the pathogen. The second way that a positive blood organism can be secondary to another infection site is that the blood organism is actually an element of that site-specific criterion. So in this case, if we go back to the joint, we have a patient that has on the 11th day of admission Patient has a tender hip joint and evidence of an effusion. Same on the 12th. And on the 13th, they collect a blood culture and it's positive for Staph aureus. In this case, this patient meets joint criterion 3C, which is basically those two symptoms, the tender joint and effusion, plus a positive blood culture. So the blood culture is actually an element of the joint criterion. So that's the second way that you can say that a BSI is secondary to another site of infection. If the patient can't meet either one of those, then unfortunately it can't be determined to be secondary. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about assignment of organisms, and this is just so that when you have cultures and you have a number of organisms, it's a little guidance on what to do with those, as far as do you have to report them or how they should be handled. So we're going to talk about how to assign them during the RIT and then during the SBAP. So during an RIT, you're going to just add any additional eligible pathogens that are identified from the same type of infection within an RIT to the event. We talked about that and we had an example of that. That ephesium just got added on to the E. coli. You don't have to determine that infection criteria are met again. That's the beauty of the RIT. You know, we used to say, well, you're going to have to determine if the patient's infection is resolved or not. Are they still getting treated? Do they still have symptoms? You don't have to do that anymore with the RIT. You're just going to add it on and be done with it. Easy peasy. During an SBAP, there has to be at least one matching pathogen to the organism from the specimen site. Now, from a specimen. So that could be either whatever specimen you're using, could be a site-specific specimen, or it could have been a blood culture that you were using. In that example with the joint aspirate, you used a blood culture. An eligible pathogen has to match at least one of those organisms. There are some pathogen exclusions for some specific infection definitions. Probably the one that comes to mind most are urinary tract infections and pneumonia with yeast. Excluded pathogens can't be just added on to an infection. So if you have a urinary tract infection with E. coli, I actually think I have an example coming up here that we'll cover. Let's cover this. A 45-year-old patient that's admitted on January 1st with Guillain-Barré, admitted to the MICU. On the 11th, he's got a fever. On the 12th, he has a fever. On the 13th, they collect a urine culture that's positive for 100,000 colony-forming units of E. coli. On the 14th, they collect a blood culture with E. coli and Candida albicans. And on the 18th, they collect a urine culture that's positive for 100,000 CFUs of Enterococcus. And let's just say that your facility is reporting all healthcare-associated infections to NHSN. You live in Pennsylvania. Anybody here live in Pennsylvania or work in Pennsylvania? Yeah. Sorry. Not a good place. Okay, so which of the following is true for NHSN reporting? The patient has only an LCBI on January 14th with E. coli and C. albicans, or B, they have a SUDI 1A on January 11th with E. coli and Enterococcus and a secondary BSI, but they also have an LCBI with Candida albicans on January 14th. Wow. People know this one. That's good. That's good. The answer is B. You guys are correct. That's okay. We're short on time. Thanks, Cheryl. So good job. You're correct. It's B. Let's look at these two organism assignment rules. In this example, a patient meets SUDI criterion with a positive urine culture and a fever within the infection window period. The date of an event is day 11. The repeat infection time frame is day 11 through 24. The secondary BSI attribution period is day 10 through 24. In this case, it's 15 days. And during the SBAP, a blood culture is collected which is positive for E. coli and Candida albicans. And the E. coli matches the urine culture, which is used to meet the SUDI criterion. Therefore, it's considered secondary to the SUDI. However, because Candida albicans is an excluded pathogen for UTI, it cannot be assigned as a primary or as a secondary bloodstream infection to the SUDI. Instead, other primary sources for Candida have to be considered according to the secondary BSI guide. So, as I said, maybe they have a urinary tract infection. No, can't do a urinary tract infection. Maybe they have decubitus that you collect cultures from the margins and it's positive for Candida. In that case, it could be secondary to that. But if not, it may have to be considered a primary BSI. Okay. If a BSI pathogen can be reported for more than one infection source, so an example, it might be assigned as a secondary BSI pathogen to different primary site infections, for example, a urinary tract infection and an intra-abdominal infection at the same time. So in this example, an organism is assigned as a secondary BSI pathogen to two different primary infection sites. Two primary infections have been identified. In this case, both an intra-abdominal infection and a urinary tract infection. So they had a temp on the 9th day of admission with abdominal pain and a CT-guided drainage of abdominal fluid with E. coli collected from that on the 11th. So this patient met the IAB criteria, but the patient also had a blood culture that was collected during the SBAP of that IAB infection. So that is considered secondary bloodstream infection because it matched the organism. At the same time, or during some of the same time, the patient also had a urine culture collected, which was positive for E. coli, and they had fevers, and the patient met the urinary tract infection. So they have a UTI, and because the blood matches that, we would just have you report them both. You're not reporting any extra urinary or any extra infections. We're just accounting for the blood using a set of rules. BSI organisms may be assigned to more than one infection source. For example, they can be assigned as a secondary BSI organism to a site-specific infection, such as urinary tract infection, and also assigned as an additional organism to our primary BSI event. So again, you won't be reporting any more infections. You'll just be accounting for the organisms that you have. An example is here where the patient has an LCBI first on day 9 with Staph aureus and E. coli. And during that RIT for the LCBI, they have another blood culture with E. coli on day 17 that just gets added on to the other LCBI. If you had reported it, you would just report the E. coli as another pathogen. But the patient also ends up meeting a urinary tract infection criteria and has matching pathogens there, so that E. coli also gets added on as secondary to the UTI. We don't know where it's from. We're just accounting for it with a set of rules. All right. I know that I am trying to make up time. We ran a little bit over with our first two presentations. I do want to, however, make you aware of some tools that we have that are really, really helpful for you if you haven't used them. One new tool that we have are these healthcare-associated infection checklists. How many of you are aware of those? Can I see a show of hands? Most of you, good. These are really helpful. They have all of the criteria for the various types of infections and you can with check boxes. So if you're a person that likes to work in that way, you can take them with you and you can just sort of check them off and make sure that the patient meets criteria. They're modeled after the Tennessee Healthcare Associated Infection Checklists. So we thank Tennessee for spearheading that in the beginning. This is where you can find them, various places. And we also have a healthcare associated infection and a present on admission worksheet generator. We don't call it a calculator, and there's a reason that we don't call it a calculator. And I'll tell you what that is in just a second. But I do want you to know that it doesn't store any information. So, once you exit out, it's gone. It doesn't send us any information. So your infections don't get reported that way. And you'll find it under the supporting materials. What I've highlighted here is actually there are paper versions of this. I don't know why anybody would want to use those, but we make them available to you. So the reason that we call it a worksheet generator and not a calculator is because it relies on you, the user, to ensure that all of the elements of the infection criteria are met and entered into the worksheet generator, and that the dates are correct. So it's really not a confirmation, but it's a tool. And as they say, GIGO, right? Garbage in, garbage out. You got to make sure that it's right. Here's an example. In this case, the patient met joint criterion 3C, had swelling, pain, and limited motion, and blood culture that was positive for Staph aureus. And the worksheet generator will tell you. You go in, you check the dates that you have an element, and you can type into it what those elements are. So that's all been typed in: swelling, pain, limited motion. And the system is telling you that this is a present on admission infection because the date of an event was on the admission date. But what happens if we didn't put in that first element? And all we put in was that they had a positive blood culture. Now it's going to tell you that you have an HAI because it doesn't know about that other piece. So that's why I say it's not a calculator, it's a worksheet generator, and you have to make sure that you put in all of the pertinent information. Okay? But it is a very helpful tool. As you can see, it provides you the RIT and the SBAP and and gives you an answer if you have all of the information correct. As I said, there's a worksheet. Also, I won't spend a lot of time on this. I don't think a lot of people are using it. This is what it looks like. And we also provide an example of one filled out so that you can see if you're interested. Okay. I want to talk really briefly about what's new for 2019, aside from the big types of infections that you're going to hear about later. Really, there's not a lot. In the spinal abscess criteria, we have kind of just made that a broader category. Instead of just being a spinal abscess, we've added the word or/infection because we recognize and we've heard from users that sometimes the patient has an infection, but nobody documents abscess in the chart. And so we've provided a criterion. One, we've added or from purulent material found because that's something that we've heard happens a lot. They don't necessarily culture it, but they have found that. And so it really just helps, especially in making a secondary BSI attribution if you don't have to have the word abscess, but there's clearly evidence of infection. These are the resources for what I've talked about today. And in summary, we do have these basic rules that apply for identifying device-associated infections, as well as those infections in Chapter 17, the IWP, DOE, RIT, and the SBAP. We talked about pathogen assignment, and I do want to tell you that in Chapter 2, there are lots of examples of these. So if you haven't looked at them, I would say go in and look at them. They're very, very helpful. Cindy Gross was the person that created most of those examples, and they're really very good examples for you to use. And then we just covered the information about broadening the spinal abscess definition. I'm going to give a plug here. You'll probably see this throughout the year. For those of you, how many of you are aware of the case studies that we have that we publish in AGIC. A fair amount of you, but a fair amount of you are not. These are wonderful tools to use. They can be used within your department if you want to see look at your inter-rater reliability, see if you're all identifying infections the same way. They could be used in local APIC chapters. We're going to cover two later this week to give you an example of a sense of what they're like. And there's also, for those of you that don't have an AGIC subscription, they're available via open access at this link here below. And what you do is you go in and you read the scenario, and then you answer questions, and you go online and answer questions, and it will tell you the right answers and the rationales for them and give you a score that only you see. One reminder that we do get, unfortunately, we get people sending us patient identifiable information sometimes, and that's, of course, a HIPAA no-no. We don't need to know the patient's name. We need to know a lot of information about the patient, but we don't need to know the patient's name. So if you send that to us, unfortunately, we're going to be required to delete it and to resend an email to you and asking you to resend it without the patient identifiable information. I think when it happens, it's just an accident. People are busy and they forget. So thank you.